On March 11, 1945, at Allied prisoner of war camp number 186 outside Marseille, France, Captain William H. Mercer filed an emergency medical report at 5:40 a.m. 8 prisoners had died in 48 hours. More were worsening. Mercer, attached to the 331st Medical Battalion, recorded high fever, severe dehydration, and rapid decline. Treatment was failing. The cause was unknown. By mid-morning, Barracks C was quarantined under Allied Medical Directive 27B, the same protocol used for suspected typhus. Windows were sealed, movement was restricted. Guards were told to limit contact. Inside the huts, conditions deteriorated quickly. The air was stale with disinfectant and sweat. Men lay on thin mattresses, some barely conscious. Others shivered under blankets despite the mild spring weather. At 9:15 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes called an emergency meeting. The written notes included a warning. If containment fails, operational stability cannot be guaranteed. Camp 186 held more than 4,000 prisoners and several hundred Allied personnel. An uncontrolled outbreak would not stay contained. By early afternoon, 2 guards collapsed after escorting sick prisoners. A nurse fainted during her shift. At 6:40 p.m., Mercer filed a second report. Suspected cases had nearly doubled. He ended with a projection. At current rate of transmission, full camp exposure possible within 14 days. No one knew what they were facing. Some suspected contaminated water. Others feared typhus. A few whispered about poisoning, but no source had been confirmed. Only rising numbers, and a camp losing control. What the command staff didn't know was that one prisoner had already begun to suspect the real cause. He just hadn't decided whether to speak. By the morning of March 12, 1945, Camp number 186 was no longer operating as a normal detention facility. At 6 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Hayes ordered the quarantine zone expanded. Barracks C and D, along with part of E, were sealed. Meal lines were suspended. Movement between blocks now required written permission. The orders followed Allied Medical Directive 27B, the same procedures used during typhus outbreaks in Italy the previous year. Still, new patients kept appearing. Captain Mercer's morning report listed 11 additional prisoners with high fever and dehydration. 3 were unconscious. He noted, cases now appearing in multiple sectors. No clear pattern. Medical staff began checking everything. Water from the main well and reserve tanks was sent to a field laboratory run by the 15th Medical Corps. Food storage areas were inspected. Kitchen workers were questioned. Latrines were disinfected again. Rodent traps were placed around the barracks. Nothing helped. Laboratory results showed the water was clean. Rations were safe. No spoiled supplies were found. Each explanation collapsed. Inside the command tent, disagreements grew. Some officers blamed recent transfers from northern Italy. Others pointed to unsterilized bedding. Intelligence officers quietly raised the possibility of deliberate contamination. None of it could be proven. At 2:30 p.m., Hayes sent a report to headquarters in Toulon. Source of infection remains unknown. Current measures not effective. Inside the barracks, tension spread. Prisoners argued over water. Some accused guards of neglect. Others accused fellow inmates of hiding symptoms. Many feared punishment or reduced rations. By evening, the infirmary was full. Cots lined the hallways. Storage rooms became makeshift wards. The smell of disinfectant mixed with sweat and sickness. Nurses worked until their hands shook. Doctors moved from bed to bed, recording temperatures, knowing it wasn't enough. Corporal James Lewis, a medical orderly, wrote that night, "We're treating symptoms, not causes. It feels like guessing in the dark." Before dawn on March 13th, 5 more prisoners died. 2 guards reported fever. The quarantine expanded again. Still, there was no diagnosis, no source, no explanation that held. The camp was fighting something it couldn't see, and somewhere inside the wire, the answer was already there. No one in charge had recognized it yet. When Hans Keller arrived at Camp number 186 on October 18, 1944, his intake file gave no reason for special attention. He was listed as prisoner number 24791. Age, 32. Former occupation, sanitation engineer. Residence, Freiburg, Germany. Risk classification, low. There were no disciplinary notes, no escape attempts, no intelligence flags. To camp administrators, he was just another exhausted prisoner. Keller had been captured near the Vosges Mountains during the Allied advance and transferred through several camps before reaching Marseille. By the time he arrived, he was underweight and careful to avoid attention. Under camp regulations, low-risk prisoners were assigned to maintenance work. Keller was placed on latrine and drainage duty. Each day, under guard supervision, he emptied waste pits, cleared trenches, and repaired leaking pipes. His work took him through kitchens, wash areas, and sleeping quarters, places most prisoners avoided. Guards rarely watched him closely. He followed instructions, spoke little, kept his head down. But the file did not tell the full story. Before the war, Keller had worked for the Municipal Sanitation Office in Freiburg. He inspected water lines and sewage systems and had training in disease prevention in crowded neighborhoods. In 1939, he attended a regional health seminar on typhoid and cholera. None of this appeared in his POW records. In a letter sent through the Red Cross in November 1944, he wrote, "They have me cleaning drains and pipes. It feels strange to do the same work without tools or authority." By March 1945, as illness spread, Keller began noticing small details. Wastewater behind Barracks D, overflowing latrines, flies near ration crates, men washing cups in drainage channels, pipes beside open trenches. To most people, these were ordinary problems. To Keller, they formed a pattern. It was the same pattern he had seen before outbreaks in civilian housing. Quietly, he began making notes on scraps of cardboard, marking where fevers appeared first and which barracks were worst affected. Still, in the eyes of the system, he remained what the paperwork said: a low-risk prisoner, a sanitation worker. A man with no authority, no influence, no right to intervene. Even as he started to understand what was happening, he had no safe way to act on it. Not yet. Before the camp, before quarantine orders and armed escorts, Hans Keller lived in Freiburg, Germany, on Lorettostrasse near the Dreisam River. City records from 1937 list him as a sanitation inspector for the Southern District. His job was simple: test water samples, inspect sewage lines, and respond to public health complaints in crowded neighborhoods. Most days followed the same pattern. He left home before 7 with a worn leather satchel of tools and forms. Mornings were spent checking pipe connections behind apartment blocks. Afternoons were spent filing reports in a small municipal office that smelled of paper and damp coats. He was not politically active. He had no military ambitions. In a post-war interview in 1951, his wife Marta said, "He cared about water pressure and broken drains. That was his world." They married in 1936 and rented 2 rooms above a bakery. On Sundays, they walked along the river paths or visited Marta's parents in Emmendingen. In 1938, Keller applied for a promotion, hoping to improve waste systems in working-class housing. Then the war began. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Keller was drafted. Because of his experience, he was assigned to a logistics unit handling water supply and waste management for troop camps. In a letter from May 1940, he wrote, "The uniform is new, but the work is familiar." By 1943, Allied bombing had damaged infrastructure. Field sanitation became improvised. Clean water grew scarce. Disposal systems were rushed and incomplete. The standards he once followed no longer applied. In February 1944, his unit moved into northeastern France during the retreat. In October, near the Vosges Mountains, his convoy was surrounded and captured. His last letter to Marta, sent through the Red Cross before transfer to Camp No. 186, was brief. "I am alive. I am well enough. I think of home every day." At the camp, he kept that letter folded inside his jacket. He read it at night under dim light while other prisoners whispered about rations and rumors. The man now emptying latrines under guard had once protected a city's water supply. The work was different in scale, but not in principle. And as illness spread inside Camp 186, that knowledge might soon matter again, if anyone was willing to listen. Camp No. 186 had been built to hold around 2,500 prisoners. By March 1945, it held more than 4,100. The increase followed Allied Directive 42A, issued in January, which required camps in southern France to absorb new transfers as the front shifted east. The order emphasized speed. Infrastructure upgrades were not addressed. Additional barracks were built quickly. Sanitation systems were not expanded at the same pace. A supply inventory from February 28 showed the camp operating below recommended sanitation capacity. Chlorine shipments were delayed by damaged rail lines. Replacement pipes requested months earlier had not arrived. Under Camp Regulation 40C, structural repairs required written authorization and approval from regional command. Requests moved slowly through multiple offices. Conditions did not. Weather records from early March show several days of rain. Inspection notes mention standing water behind barracks D and E. Drainage trenches overflowed. Waste runoff collected near walkways. Medical staff had filed complaints about overcrowding in late February. They were acknowledged. No changes followed. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes prioritized security and escape prevention. Major operational changes required formal confirmation of an epidemic. In a March 3rd memorandum, he wrote, "Until epidemic status is confirmed, standard procedures remain in effect." That meant no evacuation, no population reduction, no major reconstruction. 4,000 men shared facilities designed for far fewer. Water lines ran close to open waste trenches installed months earlier. Kitchen crews conserved fuel, limiting boiling and cleaning cycles. No single decision caused the outbreak. There was no clear negligence, but the system was stretched thin. When the first deaths were recorded on March 11th, the response followed procedure: meetings, reports, incremental measures. The framework held, for the moment. Whether it could last was uncertain. By March 13, 1945, Camp No. 186 was under strict restrictions. 5 barracks were sealed. More than 100 prisoners were under observation. Most movement inside the camp was suspended. Only sanitation and burial details continued. That morning, Standing Order 14C was issued. It prohibited prisoners from approaching medical officers or administrators without written permission. Violations were punished with isolation or reduced rations. For Hans Keller, the order mattered. By then, he was convinced something was wrong. Keller continued his sanitation duties under guard supervision, emptying waste pits and clearing drainage trenches while guards watched from nearby posts. As he worked, he noticed patterns: rainwater flowing from latrine areas toward drinking water pipes, runoff collecting beside wash stations, overflow trenches draining near food preparation areas, prisoners rinsing cups in standing water. To Keller, the connection was clear. Contamination was spreading through the water system. Camp inspection notes from March 12th recorded drainage overflow behind barracks D, temporary barriers ineffective. No repairs followed. On March 13th, Keller tried to speak to Corporal Lewis during a supply delivery. He pointed to the flooded trench and tried to explain what he had seen. Lewis listened briefly, then told him to return to work. Later, Keller approached a junior guard he knew. He described how runoff was reaching the pipes. The guard warned him not to interfere. That week's duty log listed 2 prisoners disciplined for unauthorized instructions. Both were placed in segregation and lost food privileges. Keller had seen men disappear for less. That evening, a prisoner from Barracks D collapsed near the latrines. He was carried to the infirmary on a blanket and died within an hour. The medical log recorded acute dehydration, underlying cause undetermined. By nightfall, Keller was certain the outbreak would not stop unless drainage and water systems were separated. But that would mean shutting down half the camp. It would require new orders, emergency authority, and trust in a prisoner. None existed. So Keller stayed silent, and contaminated water kept moving through the camp. Men kept drinking it. The system held him in place. The illness did not. Between March 14 and March 18, 1945, conditions at Camp No. 186 worsened rapidly. Medical records showed new infections every day. On March 14, 39 prisoners were seriously ill. On March 15, the number rose to 56. On March 16th, it reached 72. By March 18th, more than 130 men were under treatment. Captain Mercer's reports became shorter and more urgent. On March 16th, he wrote, "Patient intake exceeds capacity, mortality increasing, staff exhausted." Isolation tents were set up along the eastern fence. Canvas dividers were hung inside barracks. Sick prisoners were separated with ropes and blankets. It reduced movement. It did not stop the disease. Supply records from March 17th show that morphine, saline, and disinfectant stocks fell below emergency levels. Requests were sent to Toulon and Lyon. Deliveries were delayed because of damaged rail lines. Inside the infirmary, conditions deteriorated. 2 men often shared a bed. Thermometers were wiped and reused. Buckets were placed under bunks. The air smelled of sweat, vomit, and antiseptic. Corporal James Lewis wrote on March 15, "We are running out of space and time. Men are dying faster than we can move them." Several close calls followed. On March 16th, a truck carrying clean water broke down near Aix-en-Provence. For 12 hours, some wards relied on untreated well water. The next day, a fire destroyed part of the linen store, forcing staff to reuse soiled bedding. Deaths continued. 4 on March 15, 6 on March 16, 5 on March 17. Burial records list 17 interments in 3 days. Graves were dug after dark, yet small changes appeared. In Barracks F, where prisoners dug shallow drainage channels, infections slowed. In Barracks B, where guards allowed extra boiling of water, cases stabilized. Medical staff noticed but could not explain it. A March 18 report stated, "Localized improvements observed, cause undetermined." Keller noticed too. He compared illness lists with his own notes. The same areas kept appearing: cleaner water, better drainage, fewer fevers. The pattern was consistent. No formal investigation followed. Command focused on quarantine lines and death counts. By March 18th, the outbreak had not officially slowed. But there were signs it might be stopped, if someone understood why. On March 19th, 1945, Captain Mercer received water test results from the 15th Medical Corps Laboratory in Toulon. The samples had been taken more than a week earlier, but were delayed by damaged rail lines and fuel shortages. The findings were clear. Samples from near Barracks D and F showed heavy bacterial contamination. Fecal matter was present in surface runoff and in several drinking water pipes. The summary stated, "Probable transmission through contaminated drainage and supply water." Mercer compared the reports with his case records. The match was immediate. The worst contamination appeared in the same areas with the highest infection rates. He forwarded the packet to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. At the same time, duty logs show that Corporal Lewis requested permission to bring Hans Keller to the infirmary after noticing the maps Keller kept inside his jacket. Keller arrived carrying scraps of cardboard marked with dates, barrack numbers, and illness counts. He placed them beside Mercer's files. They matched, barrack by barrack, day by day. For the first time, the outbreak looked organized, not random, not mysterious, a system failure. Mercer asked Keller about his background. Keller described his work inspecting water and sewage systems in Freiburg. He explained how small leaks and collapsed trenches could contaminate entire networks. Hayes listened. He remained cautious. Camp rules did not treat prisoners as technical advisors, but the evidence was growing. Laboratory reports, inspection notes, medical charts, Keller's maps, all pointed in the same direction. That afternoon, Hayes authorized a limited inspection near Barracks D and F. Engineers found collapsed trenches, cracked joints, and runoff pooling against supply lines. A follow-up report concluded temporary drainage systems compromised, cross-contamination likely. After more than a week of uncertainty, the camp finally had an answer. Not a theory, not a rumor, evidence, but fixing it would mean shutting down parts of the camp and rebuilding drainage. None of that had been approved. The truth was clear. Whether anyone would act on it remained uncertain. On March 20th, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes sat in the administrative tent at Camp No. 186 with 3 documents on his desk. The laboratory report from Toulon, the engineering inspection summary, Captain Mercer's medical projections, all pointed to the same conclusion. The outbreak was being driven by contaminated drainage and water lines near barracks D and F. The engineering report stated, "Continued operation without structural separation presents serious and immediate health risk." The proposed solution was extensive. Drainage trenches would need rebuilding, water pipes rerouted, barracks D and F evacuated, food areas relocated. The estimate projected at least 10 days of work and partial suspension of operations. Security would be reduced, perimeter patrols thinner, supply deliveries disrupted. Under Allied detention rules, changes of that scale required regional approval. That could take weeks. Hayes faced two options: follow procedure and wait, or act without authorization and risk discipline, loss of command, or court-martial. Captain Mercer urged immediate action. In a memo dated March 20th, he wrote, "Delay will result in additional preventable fatalities." Security officers disagreed. An internal note warned, "Construction activity increases risk of disorder and escape." The choice was clear: protect health or protect control. Keller was not in the meeting. He continued sanitation duty under guard supervision. But nothing changed. No crews arrived, no trenches reopened, no pipes moved. The runoff remained. That evening, 3 more prisoners from Barracks F were admitted. One guard collapsed on patrol. The medical log noted, "Case count rising despite confirmed source." Hayes postponed the decision. He ordered more reviews, more estimates, more assessments. Time passed. The trenches stayed open, the water lines stayed active, the rules stayed in place, and the outbreak continued. The camp knew the cause. Whether it would act in time was still uncertain. At 6:30 a.m., on March 22, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes signed an emergency order titled Temporary Operational Directive 19C. The document suspended normal rules for sanitation and infrastructure work, allowing repairs to begin immediately without regional approval. Hayes signed it after reviewing the overnight medical report. 4 prisoners had died. A 5th was critical, and for the first time, a guard from Barracks E showed the same symptoms. The medical log noted, "Cross-population transmission confirmed." That changed everything. At 7:15 a.m., trucks from the 412th Construction Battalion arrived with pumps, replacement pipes, digging equipment, chlorine, and temporary water lines. Work began within the hour. Barracks D and F were evacuated. Prisoners were moved to temporary shelters near the eastern fence. Roll calls were held every hour. Water service in affected areas was shut down. Emergency tanks supplied boiled water only. Engineers marked damaged drainage areas with chalk. Collapsed trenches were reopened. Waste was cleared by hand. Old pipes were disconnected. New sealed lines were installed above ground. Floodlights were set up by evening. Generators ran through the night. Crews rotated in 6-hour shifts. Medical staff checked workers for illness. The smell of chlorine spread across the camp. Hans Keller assisted under supervision, pointing out 3 junctions where runoff had entered cracked pipes. Engineers confirmed each location. At 9:30 p.m., the system was flushed and refilled. Samples were taken. Boiled water and emergency rations were distributed overnight. On March 23 at 9 a.m., test results showed no contamination. By midday, admissions slowed. Within 2 days, severe cases dropped sharply. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, there were empty beds in the infirmary. The repairs had worked, but they came late, and the full cost had not yet been counted. By March 25, 1945, medical reports at Camp Number 186 showed that the outbreak was under control. New infections had fallen to fewer than 5 per day. Isolation tents were taken down, water restrictions were eased, routine gradually returned. But the records made clear what it had cost. Between March 11 and March 23, burial logs list 37 prisoner deaths. 4 guards also died. More than 200 men required intensive treatment. Many were too weak to resume normal duties. Captain Mercer's final summary, filed on March 27, noted, "Mortality exceeded projections due to delayed infrastructure intervention. The infirmary remained strained for weeks. Staff worked extended shifts. 2 orderlies were hospitalized for exhaustion. Several nurses requested reassignment. Supply records show that reserves of morphine, saline, and antibiotics were depleted. Replacement shipments did not arrive until early April. Recovery was slow for many. Medical notes from April describe ongoing weakness, digestive problems, and recurring fevers. Some prisoners were reassigned to lighter work. Others were removed from labor details entirely. Letters reviewed by camp censors mention fear and sleeplessness. One prisoner wrote, "Every cup feels dangerous now." Families of the dead were notified through Red Cross channels. Most received short notices without detailed explanation. Grave markers near the eastern perimeter carried only numbers and dates. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes submitted an after-action report in late March. It acknowledged delays but defended adherence to procedure. All actions were taken within regulatory limits, the report stated. No disciplinary measures followed. Hayes remained in command until the camp closed later in 1945. Hans Keller returned to sanitation duty. There was no official recognition. His name did not appear in the outbreak reports. The camp resumed its routine. Meals were served, roll calls continued, work details returned, but the graves remained, and so did the question of whether the delay had made the difference. Camp number 186 closed in November 1945. Repatriation records show that most remaining prisoners were sent home by early winter. The barracks were dismantled, drainage trenches were filled, temporary water lines were removed. By 1946, regional planning documents listed the site as cleared for civilian use. What happened in March 1945 did not become public history. The outbreak appears only briefly in internal medical and logistical reports. There was no inquiry, no memorial, no public acknowledgement. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes returned to active duty and retired in the early 1950s. His service record mentions the outbreak only once, in routine notes. Captain Mercer continued working in medicine and later moved into public health. Neither man was publicly questioned. Hans Keller returned to Freiburg in December 1945. City employment files show he resumed work with the sanitation department the following year. By 1947, he was again inspecting water and drainage systems. There is no record of him speaking publicly about the camp. No interviews, no memoirs. To most people, he was simply a civil servant, a husband, a father, a man who checked pipes. By the 1960s, most physical traces of the camp had disappeared. Housing developments covered the former perimeter. Roads followed old fence lines. Few residents knew what had been there. Yet the outbreak left a quiet mark. A 1948 Allied medical review described an unnamed detention camp where delayed repairs increased deaths. It concluded, environmental remediation must precede administrative approval during epidemic conditions. No location was given. No names were attached. But the description matched Camp No. 186. No monument stands where 37 prisoners and 4 guards died. No plaque lists their names. But their deaths changed procedures and training manuals. They shaped future outbreak responses. And the story leaves one question. How many lives were lost while paperwork moved from desk to desk? At Camp No. 186, survival depended on whether someone was willing to listen. For a few days in March 1945, that person was a prisoner, and almost no one noticed.